Hi, I'm back. That was just a short video before, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about, I guess, some of my visions for things. And this is kind of on the back of having had a conversation with, of all people, someone who's a witch. Yeah, and who had said that I underestimate myself, and I can be doing better with things in my life. I can move on from where I'm stuck, and that in a year's time I would change jobs. I mean, I was a bit gobsmacked because, like many people, that's not my first go to. But I could see what they were saying, and to be honest, I want better things. I want to be able to make good on some of the visions of projects that I want to develop, like Decolonial Trans, which is an essay collection, but also other things like, on the basis of, I don't know, like the talk panel that we're doing in Puerto Rico and putting as well Sister Girl Visions front and center of trans justice efforts in the way in which I hope to situate at least some of their perspectives. I have a lot of sister girl friends, actually, pretty good couple of friends in particular, and they're family. They're family to me. Uh, they always will be, and I deeply love and trust them. So, anyway, there's a lot of work that I want to do, and keeping up the energy, keeping up the capacity might require me to be in a different context. These are critical times for trans lives, for racialized people's lives, and we need to keep producing good critical work in response to that. So that's part of it. I think that I probably could be in a better context where I wasn't so kind of dominated by all the admin stuff and teaching load that people commonly in this country, if they work as full time academics, have to contend with. It's just not the same in North America, for example, in particular the US. We don't have teaching assistants. I don't necessarily agree with that form of exploitation, don't get me wrong. But for example, a colleague of mine teaches 2 courses a semester. It's not unusual for me to be teaching double that and with more contact hours and more marking and no teaching assistants. It just feels really not very sustainable, and I feel like held back in a lot of ways. It's not that I don't find the work here fulfilling, and the people that in particular that I work with are very supportive, right? That's not a critique of them. It's just like maybe knowing when it's time, to move on. And I remember just before Trump got into power, just before the election, right? That I saw 2 positions come up at San Diego State University, one in regard to Horteria studies, which is a kind of subsection of Chicanx studies, and also, Mexican American studies, if you don't know that term, but also one that had to do with borders and health, borders, migrants, and health. And I have a bit to offer in both of those domains. And, they look very favorably on trans scholars. And obviously, being someone who is in Latin American studies as well and trans, like I kind of felt like in some ways I could have fit the bill, but I didn't apply because when the election result came through, like like many people, I was just totally overwhelmed, and I just thought I can't be taking this up. Should I be granted an interview and be successful in this setting? Like it's just, a lot of us were very flawed, right, and still are. But that's not to say that it's not worth having connections with people in the US, including within our communities. And I'm very passionate about these things. And anyway, maybe the witch was right. which way shall I go? Which they seem to think that it wouldn't be that hard and that I wouldn't be taking a huge financial cut or any of those things. But following that video where I talked about Marsha P. Johnson and dreaming big and deep dreaming, I want to adopt that approach and not underestimate. None of us should underestimate ourselves, by the way. This is not me crying about myself or my potential or whatever. We all have down times and we doubt ourselves, definitely. And we also feel like we're not valued at times. But rising above that and seeing what our full capacities are, having a transformative vision and relationship with others, for others, I don't know, that's kind of where it's at, both in scholarship but also in activism. And I feel like my life needs to start moving in those directions, and everything from mental health to survivorship to community trauma to intergenerational trauma and transness as well. There's a lot there, and I feel like life is asking me to step up. I felt like that when I was in New Orleans. Everyone telling me not to go, and then maybe having a dim view of my decision to go in some cases, because there are some out there that just boycott the notion of going to the US for conferences and so on, but also that have basically put a fence around the country because they just declare it as off limits and difficult and dangerous for trans people. But so many of us have friends in community there, people who are undocumented, people who are migrants, racialized peoples, and trans. And we don't support the current administration's executive orders and very questionable legal bases for things like deportations. We don't. I have a history of working as an expert witness in asylum cases for particularly trans women fleeing violence, community and familial and institutional, from Mexico and into the United States. God help them. Anyone that's trying to cross the border or currently is, in detention and facing the prospect of being deported. Like, these are the sorts of things that I worked on with legal clinics in Brooklyn, in Chicago, in LA, in immigration court itself. So I've done some of this work pro bono in my life. I've met with the so-called clients, I don't like that term, the claimants, and I've heard their histories, their life stories, as well as being able to attest to the different dimensions of those life stories. And I just want to move more in the direction of doing really proactive stuff. Obviously, with the current administration, it's going to be really hard for anyone to have any kind of justice in terms of immigrant justice. But we can't lose hope, and the wheels will turn, right? And like today, me going out on a march, we've got to get politically involved in it, wherever we're at, right? Like in the US and Australia, and support organizations and support grassroots collectives, right? Do some volunteer labor, get involved. I'm concerned about the current state of things between Pakistan and India, very concerned about the escalation of that conflict and the implications. It's quite murderous and just noxious in the extreme. But until today, I didn't see anything in the Australian media about it. Can you believe that? So I'm concerned for friends of mine in India as well, who no doubt find this very worrying and really suspicious on both governments' counts kind of thing. Unfortunately, this has led to, from a Hindu nationalist kind of angle, a ramping up of anti-Pakistani sentiment in it, and predictably anti-Muslim sentiment, and just nationalistic sentiments. I don't support either side of the conflict in terms of, they don't represent people on the ground, and war and violence is never the response. But these are issues that keep playing out, particularly in regard to the Kashmir region, obviously, but you can see the legacy of partition continue to play out, much like in the case of the dispossession of Palestinians from their land, that with the creation of the State of Israel that continues to exact its massive genocidal violence. I just think that we, in spite of our totalitarian times, particularly as enacted by the West and allies of the West, we need to resist. And my great-grandmother, Una, who was born in Madhya Pradesh, she wrote about her opinion on the Western powers, particularly in Asia. And it's in her spirit that I invoke this resistance. As much as it's just symbolic, I don't want us to lose hope. And I think that with every war or every escalation of war, taking to the streets and breaking through the media stranglehold, just as with violence against women, is so paramount.